All right, good evening. This is our first crack at doing a Bible study. I talked about it a little bit in the sermon tonight as we kick this thing off. And joining me is Michael Ray, and I'll let Michael introduce himself a little bit. But Michael, as you've heard me say a few times from sermons and from the pulpit, is the reason for many of the crazy ideas I have and preach to you all. Michael, introduce yourself, and we'll talk a little bit about the format.
So that's something that no one should ever be forced to take credit for, and I will not. All I can tell is I've known Mike a long time, and so this is really a unique opportunity. So we bounce this stuff around all the time, and so now we're going to see if it's of any value when we actually turn a recorder on, or if it only gets us in lots of trouble. It'll be very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Most of these conversations, we do have to preface if it's difficult for some of you all to follow. Most of these conversations happen in the car while we're both driving and trying to parse out some ideas. But what we're going to try to do here is we're going to work through the book of Philippians first, and we're going to start tonight with just some intro and background. And part of it's going to be, how we would approach the study, and part of it's going to be the actual background and content. We assume we've got a various level of listeners here. Some of you are teaching Bible classes. Some of you would be teaching Bible classes if we were having Bible classes and are looking for content yourself. So we're hopeful maybe, part of our banner discussions, thought process can help you either as you're preparing or if you're sitting in and you just want to learn a little bit more about the book of Philippians. Michael, how'd we end up in Philippians?
That's a good question. So, one of these conversations that you and I have, and I call you when I'm walking the dog. That's my call Mike time. And so I'm walking the dog a few days ago, and I call Mike, and we talk about, what if we want to go through a Bible study format, something like this, and what could be of value. And one of the things that was talked about was, the Apostle Paul in the context of the book of Philippians talks about extreme joy, and while at the same time he's incarcerated. And so, how do you get to a place where you got this overflowing of joy and peace, even though life circumstances aren't, you aren't where you want to be. And I think it's highly likely that given the present distress, as the Apostle Paul would say, 1 Corinthians 7, in the present distress, there's a lot of people that aren't where they want to be. And how do you still present yourself with joy? It just seemed like a natural book to tackle, given the environment.
And while definitely I don't think Michael or I want to compare your home to being in jail. I don't think that's too fair of an assessment. But here's the thing, and this is part of it as you get to looking at the background of Philippians. And one of the things that we think is always very important when you're going to tackle a book, a subject, a topic, it's very important to understand the context. So as Michael said, context here is Paul's in jail. And I think sometimes we think that Paul's in jail like he was in Acts chapter 15. He's locked in a cellar in the stocks in the center of the jail. However, historically accurate, that's not exactly right. Paul was really in house arrest in Rome. He was set up in his own apartment. People were coming and going as they pleased. Now, it gets worse later when he writes 2 Timothy and he's being poured out as a drink offering. Those things get bad later. But in this early iteration of Paul's imprisonment here in Rome, I think it's important to understand kind of where he's at. And sometimes when we talk through this, we want to put Paul in stocks and, in chains. But at this time, it's not that bad. It's actually quite akin to what you and I are doing right now, only people can't come and go from our house.
Yeah, so, Dr. Luke records that for us, right? And so end of Acts chapter 28, the last two verses of the book of Acts talk about the people that are coming and going at their own expense. He's staying in a place that he's renting, apparently, or as Luke records for us, at his own expense. He stays at this place and people are coming and going. And you may talk about having a ball and chain at your house, but the only thing that might differentiate your house from my house from where Paul is, he literally was chained probably to a Roman soldier, right? And so he's still incarcerated, but the environment ain't terrible. In the big scheme of things. He's probably, and it might be actually it might be a really cool conversation. Where's Paul getting the funds to pay for this rented apartment?
Right.
In his collection of friends and associates, somebody, is he making tents in Rome or somebody fronting the money for him? But he's got a rented place there in Rome, and for Paul, being chained to somebody is not that terrible either. I mean, he's got a ready audience all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And as these guards change out that are chained to Paul, it would be curious to know his conversion rate on the guards he's changed to, because I bet it ain't terrible.
Yeah, and it's not like he's sitting there, woe is me. And I think that's part of one of the discussions that we've got to have here. Again, given the present distress is, are you making lemonade out of lemons? Paul is on house arrest here, but I assure you, he didn't stop converting. He didn't stop talking. He didn't stop teaching. And to Michael's point too, this is something, that we would want to investigate, and we will as we build this background of, looking at those funds. He mentions to the Philippians that they had sent help to him once and again, whether that was to Rome, whether that was on one of the first, one of his early missionary journeys. It's hard to tell, but it's an interesting thing to think about that, here he is in this situation, and he even says to the Philippians, I wish you were just like me except for these chains, right? He doesn't like the fact that he can't go wherever he wants to go. However, he's still having an effect in the gospel. And so that's quite honestly what we're trying to do here with this Bible study and some of these virtual worship services are. We may be, not necessarily quarantined. I think, what's Andy calling healthy at home. So we're trying to be healthy at home. But we're still striving for content. We still need to iron sharpen iron. We still need to be reaching into the word. We still need to be encouraging each other. But now, instead of sitting on the back deck, we got to do it over Zoom or one of these other outlets. And I think that's important for us to know.
And this point's been made a lot, but you go to the very last two verses of the book of Philippians, and to your point, Paul, where he is, can he still be effective? Well, he says that those in Caesar's household, the saints in Caesar's household, greet you. I mean, the depth of where that, that if you think about where he is, where, what Caesar's household would mean, and remember who Caesar was. So we're talking about Nero Caesar here, and there are now saints in Caesar's household. I'm persuaded that the Christians in Rome didn't preach that gospel and affect that conversion. I think the evidence would support that it was Paul that did that. And so in quarantine, like in literal quarantine, Paul's converting, Caesar's household. And so,
yeah, it's not like Caesar's household is out.
Sounds like you need to be calling up Andy's family.
Right.
Correct. You got to have an in. Right? You're not just dialing up Nero and say, I want you to come down to Wednesday evening services.
Right. So he's the only saints that are in Nero's house are definitely a direct impact of Paul, or maybe somebody else he's converted. But he's to steal from Michael's sermon this morning, he's definitely the vector here. He's spreading whatever he can, and then letting those people go and do more work. And that's really how this goes. So context wise, this is where we would start. If Michael and I are going to teach on Philippians next quarter, the first thing we're going to start is, all right, where's Paul when he writes this? So I think we've got that down, right? We understand that he's really on house arrest. He's not chained in stocks. He's on house arrest, but chained to a prisoner. And here are some things we need to think about with the effect that he's having so far. But the other thing is, I think it's important, not only where's Paul at, but where's the church at Philippi come from? How did we get Christians at Philippi? The Philippians chapter 1, as it begins, this is one of the most amazing things to me, is Paul addresses this letter to the elders and deacons and brethren at Philippi, right? Well, where do those guys come from? How they get there? Who's the background? What do these guys look like? That's something that I always think about when I start looking at whether it be Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, Corinthians, is what's this congregation look like? So Michael, where do we figure that out at?
Well, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I would go to the first time that we, go to your concordance. First time you read Philippi, you go to Acts chapter 16, right? And so, I think you and I would probably both, talk about, how does Paul first get to Philippi? And that's a great conversation. We can have that. The Macedonian call, and then going to Philippi. But there's also a really interesting conversation about what Philippi is. Not just how did the church get to Philippi, but what does the city of Philippi? Why is that important to the conversation? And I think you and I have talked about this before. It's so much more meaningful to know about the conversion of Lydia or the conversion of the Philippian jailer if you understand about Philippi, if you know what it looks like to walk into, if you know what Philippi smells like, and that's to turn a phrase. If you just get the context of what the city is, it makes a lot of this more meaningful. And in fact, it makes Philippians more meaningful. And so here would be my brief example of that is in Acts chapter 16, verse 12, when we first get to Philippi, and Dr. Luke is, prefacing the whole visit for us. He says, Philippi in verse 12, it's a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. And he kind of drops that because I assume all Luke's readers would understand that.
Right.
And maybe we don't as well. But that phrase, it was a leading city, so it was legit, somewhat of a metropolitan area, but also that it was a Roman colony. And so that phrase as an introduction to everything we read about Philippi is incredibly interesting. And it makes what Paul says in the book of Philippians about their citizenship in heaven, chapter 3, it just makes that even more meaningful when you put it against the backdrop of what they would have valued as citizens of Rome. So I don't know how deep we want to get down the rabbit hole about Roman colony stuff, but the intent was it was Rome outside of Rome, right? So the dress, the language, the laws, the citizenship. There's a great Latin phrase there. The soil was Roman. It was Roman. It was Roman soil. So anyway, that stuff like that I think is extremely significant when you think about what was the broader context of this place where Paul and Silas are going.
And I think this is so one of the things that Michael hit on here is a fallacy of Bible study that many of us have, right? And for those of you that go to Danville, you've heard me yell this 1,000 times from the pulpit. Oftentimes we read too quickly. We're trying to get through Acts chapter 16 to get to Lydia, to get to the Philippian jailer, to get to what we think is exciting. But you know what we miss? We miss that it's a leading city in Macedonia, and we miss that it's a Roman colony because we just read that too fast. And we don't stop and say, wait a minute, what does that really mean? What does that set the stage for? What does that tell us about the people? What does that tell us about their background? What does that tell us about what these guys are walking into? And I think that's so significant to spend some time there. And again, in this introductory class, if I'm teaching on Philippians, the first class, we're probably not going to spend any time in Philippians. This initial class is let's talk about what a Roman colony is. Let's talk about, what it means to be Roman citizens. Let's talk about who these people are in this makeup of the congregation. Because that's what tells you got to know the audience. The first thing we have to understand in context is who is Paul writing this letter to? Because while the book of Philippians is great for us today, it had an initial audience that it was specific to. Their problems, their background, their issue, what was going on there. This letter was written specifically for the church at Philippi. So if we don't know who they are, then we're going to miss a lot of the things that are said there. So I think that's really important is slow down in your Bible study and your reading and take point in these words and these phrases that turn up, because it's going to really help you get a broader picture of where you're at. And I, so it's funny, I kind of smiled while Michael was talking about, what the city smelled like, because I think that's exactly right. What I try to do is I want to sit in the pew, if you will, and think about where I'm at when the elders, one of the deacons, the minister stands up and reads this letter from Paul. That's what I want to think about is if I'm sitting in that pew, what do I look like? What do I feel like? What's my background? How am I taking this in initially? And I think if you can put your mind there as you're reading it, there's a lot of the text that I think will jump out at you.
And can we just admit that there's like 0% chance that they're actually sitting in pews? We can accept that, right?
Sitting on stones. I mean, we can parse that out. standing in the cave. I don't know. They were wealthy. They may have had pews.
So I'm going to go one more verse in Acts 16, just because I think it's interesting. And this goes to what you said. What did the people who, wherever they were sitting, what did the people who received this letter, what did they think about themselves? Mm-hmm. How did they view themselves? Because again, I think there's different levels of depth that you can choose to study these scriptures in, right? Is you can learn a lot from Philippians and not know anything about you can learn a lot from the book of Philippians without knowing anything about the background of Philippi, for sure, right? But if to your point, if we do go another level deeper, learn a little bit about the city, understand who these people were, why it was a Roman colony and what that meant, it just makes the lessons a little more richer. It just does. And so I think that's kind of, I'm confident there's many layers beneath where I'm at today, right? So that's why we're doing this, right? So we can keep digging. But there are things as you dig a little more into Philippi that make Philippians more meaningful. And so we keep trying to dig for that stuff. And when the Philippians say in Acts 16 verse 21, what would they say about themselves? The reason that Paul and Silas originally got in trouble in Philippi is the crowd says these men advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. You can slide however many hundreds of miles away from Rome in Macedonia, in Greece,
right?
We're saying it's not lawful for us as Romans to accept what these guys are telling us. Well, that's an extremely meaningful statement. If you think about it, it's pretty profound that these guys first thought about themselves as Romans. And what does that mean for Paul when he's writing a letter to them? When he says your citizenship is in heaven, he said you got to, what you think about yourself first, it's got to change. It's so anyways, there's things like that become more meaningful if you put show in a little bit.
Right. Well, and to that point, I mean, there's part of that I think we miss and maybe can't even appreciate to understand. I've got some friends that live in Texas, and a lot of times Texans think of themselves as from Texas first and from the United States second. But it'd be similar that right after getting annexed in, that they said, we as United States citizens, this isn't lawful. The Macedonians and the Greeks have a long, rich history. That's Alexander the Great. I mean, it was one of the great world empires. And for them, as a leading city of Macedonia, to be all in on the Roman side is I think, kind of interesting. And whether that's, just a cop-out so that they can beat these guys because they're losing business, or whether that's truly, the feeling they have, it says a lot to what it means to be a Roman colony.
It wasn't absurd for them to say. I think you're right. Maybe it was convenient for them to bring that up at that point, but it wasn't absurd for them to say. People accepted it when they said it, so that it has to mean something.
Right, which is also comical in some ways, right? That these guys, I mean, we're not that far away in history from them being a world superpower for them to all of a sudden being proud of this. It's a little comical in some ways because of that, but it got what they ultimately wanted, which was that they needed to get these guys off the street because they were losing business, and they needed to get these guys, kind of out of the way. So that brings us to kind of another point. It's very telling too, as we go through Acts chapter 16, of what kind of presses the city's buttons before these guys end up in prison, right? That the city is a economic powerhouse. I mean, this is a leading city in Macedonia because of its economic, the trade routes. Lydia is there selling purple, not in a podunk town. So if you're from Kentucky, Lydia didn't travel from Louisville to Science Hill to sell purple, okay?
How dare you?
She went to a big city with a big market where her purple would have fetched high dollar, where one, people could afford it, and two, where there was going to be a massive audience for it. So I think it's significant too to talk about the economics of the city, because that's going to lead in, I think, to a little bit of the makeup of the congregation. which the makeup of the congregation also in part of this intro is fascinating. If we talk about who these members are now, again, from Acts chapter 16, I can't tell you who all were in the building, cave, woods when they met together. Michael doesn't like that they're on pews, but whatever.
Sitting in pews.
Tell you who all was there. But I can tell you a high percentage of them, right? We know Lydia's probably there, right? She's there with her household. That's an anchor member. But who else is there is the guy that's really the main character here at the end of Acts chapter 16, which is the Philippian jailer. The jailer and his household and the prisoners that didn't run, because I think that's significant. The reason why when you go to jail they put locks on doors is because you would leave if they weren't there, right? But when we see, these people, when the ground shakes and the doors open up, the jailer's ready to commit suicide because he assumes all the prisoners left because they're prisoners and they should have left. But they're all standing there because they've heard Paul and Silas preaching and singing the gospel and, again, to steal Michael's word from this morning, being vectors all night long, spreading throughout this prison. They've heard that, and it fundamentally changed how they thought about things. Their first thought wasn't to run away. Their first thought is, I want to kind of get closer to these guys. And I think it's significant that that's the makeup. So, with that being said, Michael, what does a group of criminals look like when they become a church?
Well, what does a group of any ungodly people look like when they become a church, right? They look like a church. They look like a group of people who are struggling together, and some of them got issues, and they are becoming holy at different rates. I heard a great phrase recently. It said, you want to see a sign of death in a church is that there's no immaturity. I thought that was a fantastic way to turn that on its head. If there's no immaturity, then it means that nobody is starting to grow, right? It means we got a bunch of old guys like me who've been there for a while, and there's no nobody is spreading it around. Nobody's being a vector. And there's nothing that I like more than being able to quote myself. You know how much I enjoy that. There's nobody being a vector to start new green shoots of Christianity, and there's no immaturity. And so if there's no immaturity, the place is dead. I got a feeling Philippi was a place that had some immaturity, right? Because there were people who started as prisoners and people that started as jailers. They probably started morally in very different places, and so they had different things to work through.
But I think if we go from the premise that this is a bunch of criminals that just got out of jail, and a woman small business owner, and a Philippian jailer, and you put all those people together, don't you expect Corinth? Like, isn't that your initial expectation, that you expect this place just to be an absolute dumpster fire? You expect it to be havoc and rampant immorality. But the interesting thing is, when we start digging through the book of Philippians, we find they are by far the best put together congregation in all of the New Testament. They have the fewest amount of issues.
And I also think it's interesting that, given the economics of what you said earlier, that Philippi was a significant city, that Paul refers to them as probably not being economically affluent. And maybe that has to do with the criminal makeup of the background of some of them. But, he tells brethren in Corinth that our friends in Philippi, they gave even though they were in poverty. So we learn a little bit about the makeup of the Philippians there is if you want to go all the way back, something you said earlier, which is really smart, is, well, I mean, it came from you, but it was still relatively smart.
We've got that on recording. He said I was smart.
Paul, I said something you said was smart. That's very different. Paul, being led by the Holy Spirit and also wise, he didn't go. He was very selective about the cities where Luke reads that he goes, right? He goes to places that he can have a cultural influence, in places that can be vectors to spread. And so, places that are where there is a lot of transient people, where things can be exported easily, where there is a center of commerce, and where there's a group of people. So Paul was not like throwing darts at a map when he chose these places, So when you read in Scripture that, why did Paul go to Lystra or Derbe or Philippi or Corinth? I don't think those were random. Those were Holy Spirit inspired decisions to go to places that had the capacity to not only become holy or have Christians, but to spread the gospel quickly. So anyway, big city, economically important, and yet the membership of Philippi apparently wasn't.
Right, which again, it talks to their background. There was probably a few, the jailer probably was, although he may have lost his job over the events of that night, right? Lydia, obviously, she's a seller of purple, so she probably was doing okay. But you got a lot of criminals that are out trying to make their way. So you've got that makeup here, but what's not lacking that you find is joy and love and compassion. I mean, there are no major quote unquote issues that Paul deals with at all in this letter. I guess my initial expectation, I think maybe some of the fear out there that we have in evangelism is, if we convert a bunch of criminals, a bunch of addicts, we're going to have a church full of former criminals and addicts. I mean, this is not going to be a safe place to bring my kids. What we really want is upper middle class people. That's what we really want to bring in. I want people that look like me because the congregation is going to be so much better that way. But the truth is, we had that in Corinth. Corinth's very, very wealthy, but they were an absolute disaster. This congregation, a group of people that, in my again, this is my take, trying to read in through the text, are people that got salvation and appreciated it. They were down and out. They understood they sinned, knew what sin looked like, and came, kind of come from the bottom. I think sometimes when we've only had lowercase s sin in our life, we've only had small things that we've done, we don't really think we've done anything that bad, it's harder to fully embrace and appreciate what salvation brings. When you don't feel like it's, and I don't know how best to say this. This is what I have you on the call for, is I don't know how best to say that, for people that haven't really ever done anything wrong, it only brings them a little bit. Right? I'm just a little bit better because I have Jesus. I wasn't that bad a guy before, but you get somebody that was a scumbag that came out of jail and got Jesus, and now his life's completely transformed. You've got a bigger degree of separation and I think you've got a deeper level of appreciation for that.
So I'm not giving you credit for that point because it's Jesus' point, right? When he said to Simon, when the woman was washing his feet with her hair, and he said to Simon, if I forgive you a small debt or a big debt, which one are you going to appreciate me for more? And he said, like, I suppose the one who was forgiven more, right? I mean, that's exactly what you're saying, and so it makes a bunch of sense. Is that and Jesus understood that. Even though all sins are condemning, all sins don't affect us, affect our soul and our spirit maybe the same way. And I think, all are condemning, but it's not fair to say they're all created equal, because the impact that we have on ourselves and others is not the same from a physical aspect in some of those things. And some sins carry more scars, right? I mean, and so it's likely if the group at Philippi had that kind of background, they appreciated him more. That's a Jesus talking to Simon the Pharisee point.
So let's get to the heart of the matter, and let's ask the really hard question here. So how do we fix this? Do we advocate, our young people going and showing their wild oats, like go be a scumbag for about 5 years and then you'll really appreciate Jesus? Or as parents, what do we try to do? We try to keep our kids away from all of that stuff and raise good kids that embrace Jesus and have a spiritual life from as early on as possible. So how do we fix that within the church? How do we fix that within our spiritual lives and impart that to others? Because I think that's something that's, in some ways missing, right?
So that's exactly why I wanted to do this format, is because I knew that we weren't going to stay on Philippians and we were going to get to act, interesting and hard questions. And I knew you got the guts to ask them. So shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid, right? Romans 6 verse 1, we're all on board there. So how do you build the appreciation for what grace is without the forgiveness of a larger debt? Right? That's the question. Right. So how do you do that? That is a very profound question, because again, Jesus said those who are forgiven more will love more. So how do you deepen that love without being forgiven more. And also, I don't think that we want the church to be a place where we all go around, grocery listing what our past was so we can prove how much we love Jesus, right? I mean, that doesn't seem consistent with anything else. But look at these things and unfortunately you do run into that sometimes. Some people wear that like a badge. Well, here's all the things I did. So now look how much grace that it's almost the back of Romans chapter 6, verse 1, right? That if you wear that like a badge, you say, well, I earned more grace than you did.
Right. And it's the, and I think there's some fear, and that's the point of the parable that Jesus tells there with the laborers that were hired throughout the day, and some that, they've been there the whole time, right? And they were there at dawn, and then he's sneaking some in at 5 o'clock, and they're fussing about it. Well, you got the same wage. Like, you should both be happy with what you got and not unappreciative. And I think that sometimes comes out too when we have these conversations, is you've got the guy that may wear it as a badge of honor, or I'm a better Christian than you because I was a scumbag and now I'm better. But you also have the flip side of it, of almost some jealousy of, well, I didn't get to be a scumbag, right? I was here. It's the the brother in the prodigal son, right? I was here working the whole time, Dad, and this guy ran off and acted a fool, and now he gets to come back like nothing happened. And so I think there's some give and take there too, but that gets down to, from a leadership standpoint, from a preaching and teaching standpoint, how do we develop that level of depth without, how do you learn without the pain? How do you, get there without the scars? Because the struggle is, while there are cases of, the former drug dealer, prostitute, whatever, turned Christian, that's a small percentage, right? You can go out in that world and there's a better chance you're not coming back to Jesus than there is that you're going to find Jesus and get converted. So, there's some danger in trying to play in those waters too. But to me, the core of this is, I've got to have some appreciation that even though I don't have front page of the local paper sins, that mine are still bad too. And I think that's part of it, is we compartmentalize sins. And while some don't carry the scars, to your point, they're all bad, right? I can, if I sit up at night watching hours of internet pornography and nobody knows about it, I'm not a better guy than the bank robber, right? But I think sometimes because the private sins, the secret sins don't get exposed, they're somehow looked at as, well, you're not as bad as the bank robber or the adulterer who's broken up a family now because you kept your sins in the closet, which is completely unfair.
Yes, and then do we at times exacerbate that if we say that if your sins are of a public nature, right, versus they're of a private nature, then the remedy for those may be different. I'm not sure that there's any basis for that, right? That we got to get clean either way, no matter what that takes.
Yeah, and I think that's part of this. But as you to kind of get us somewhat back around, this is really what you get into in Bible study. And I think, if we're going to be honest with our audience, like, this is how you end up on tangents, and this is how, out of this conversation, if you're following along and taking notes and picking up some of the things that we're talking about, we've got, the basis of about a half a dozen different studies from the background on Philippians, right? There's a study about, how can I deepen my relationship with Jesus without having to become a scumbag first? There's a study here in, the makeup of congregations and why we don't evangelize to maybe some that have capital S sins. There's a lot of different ways to look at this that I think we've got to look back at ourselves and how we're studying, and then how we take and make application, because here's a perfect case study of, this is a congregation of people that the world views as awful people that are really a good congregation. They're really people that are doing good work for Jesus. They're doing good work in the kingdom, that don't have a lot of problems. There's a lot of good that's come out of this group, where we may be prejudiced to invite some of those people to services.
I would also just add by way of history that I'm going to give some of the credit to Dr. Luke there too, because we learn in Acts that he stayed behind with this group maybe as Paul went on, and so he was with this fledgling congregation of the jailer and the criminals and Lydia and the jailer's household and whoever kind of made up the core of the church at Philippi. So I'm going to give him some of the credit there. It's probably due. And wouldn't it be fascinating to know as we get to Philippians chapter 1, verse 1, who are those overseers and deacons? Are they just to do the to track and trace the the chain all the way back to Acts chapter 16? Who are the elders and what relationship do they have to those first Christians in Philippi? Did Luke convert them soon after? Were they part of the household of the jailer? Were they part of that first group of criminals? I just think that would be a fascinating. Hopefully someday we'll all get to find out those answers.
Right, and that's that. And it's not there, I think, because of 1 Corinthians, right? I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. I can trace all the way back to I was in jail 2 cells over from Paul. Like that's how good it is, right? And there'd be people that would argue that. But I think when you and Michael's got that's an outstanding point there of it's and Paul makes this point a little clearer in Corinthians. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And we have the same exact thing here. Paul may have planted, but Dr. Luke here is watering and is doing the watering. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's God giving the increase to these good brethren here that make up, this congregation and the helpfulness that they were both to Paul along his trips and while he's here, and the comfort. One of the most amazing things that you hear over and over out off the pages of this is, again, to use probably a terrible analogy, but as I read it, I see Paul smiling as he's writing these words because he's thinking about these people and he's thinking about the relationship and he's thinking about what all they've done. And you hear that joy come out over and over and over again in Philippians. And I think that's what it is. He smiles thinking about them. And we're in a weird place today, right? We don't write letters. We text each other. And so, oftentimes I know I do that. Like especially if I think I've got something funny, as I'm texting it, I'm kind of smiling as I'm sending the text, right? And you think about maybe the person on the other end, and you think about, what you're saying and what you're communicating, but we get an instant response back. When we put ourselves in Paul's spot, Paul sent this letter. It may be years before he hears back how they responded to that. But he's thinking of them and constantly thinking of how they've been. And you see it expressed in the prayers that are here in Philippians 2 about how he prays for them and about how he cares for them. And I think that special bond is something that's there too. So when we think about that in any congregation, the evangelists that are a part of that family and especially of the growth of the family or the start of that family will always have a close spot in their heart. And I know with Southside, for example, they've lost an evangelist, not lost. He moved on, a guy that was there for a lot of years and left a big mark. But it's, now he's in Tennessee, and it's not that anybody's, forgotten that Sean was there, right? You think about him fondly, and when you contact him, when you see him, in different places, you're able to continue to share those experiences. And I think that's important for the makeup of a work too.
And if you're on the other side of that, so that's the experience from, I think you accurately gave the outlook of, what was it like for Paul as he fondly thought back at Philippians. Well, put yourself on the other side of that. Put yourself in the pew in Philippi. So, that Paul, you may have met Paul, 3 times, 4 times, depending on how you read the journeys and were you even in Philippi at the time, were you a Christian at the time? So some of these people have spent some time with Paul. It's clear Paul has affection for them, but their interaction with Paul in the big scheme of things has been, fairly limited, right? Period of months, possibly over a 10-year period or whatever. And so to get this letter from Paul, just think, again, in a very limited thing, if you were to get a text from a guy that used to be your preacher, that would be meaningful to you. Whatever he said in that text was meaningful. Now put that on steroids and multiply it by 50. These brethren in Philippi got a letter from Paul, who converted some of them, who came back into the journey and strengthened some of them. And we don't want to make it sound like Paul was only there in Acts 16. We know he was also there in Acts 20 and in other places. But I just to think of how treasured that document would be.
Yeah.
You know, how many consecutive days did they read that letter publicly? You know, how treasured was that document? And again, that I hope that whatever that feeling is that they had when they read it, that we can sense a little bit of that when we read it and kind of understand it that way.
Yeah, that's to go full circle back to what we talked about. That's this level of depth we're trying to get to when we look at a passage. Is how would you feel hearing that? And then multiply that to Michael's point. What if you're in those last few verses when he's kind of sending, for lack of a better term, shout outs at the end? You know, thank this one, greet this one, you know, and their names memorialized in the canon of Scripture. And I'm sure they didn't think about it from that standpoint then. But even just that letter from the pulpit, you know, think about this one and that one and how that would have had a lasting impact that, you know, even that they would remember of, right? You know, it's almost like, and this is, again, terrible analogy, but the guy that came through for a weekend meeting 5 years ago sends a letter to your congregation and says, hey, remember Mrs. Johnson because she had a profound impact on me from the weekend meeting that I held 5 years ago. You know, and think about those things over time and how meaningful that would be if that was read in the congregation you're at today.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
How much time have we gone so far? See, this is the other terrible thing with these studies. You're
probably not best to look.
You're going to find what time flies through these things. And Michael and I have we've talked road trip length on a few topics. And you look up and it's, you know, we've been driving for an hour or two trying to get somewhere and have barely scratched the surface of a topic. And we are fully admitting of our flaws here, especially in the format of this. And we're, again, what the whole basis of this isn't supposed to be an in-depth verse by verse, tear it apart study. This is more of a conversation about how we look at things and how either one of us would, in looking at an introduction to Philippians, how we would put together this lesson, either to teach it or to preach it. These are the type of things that we would find important here, and we hope you all do too. What else, Michael? Any other things in this introduction that you make sure you wanted to point out before we wrap?
I would only say just to add on to what you said and just to close, because this probably does need to wrap up. But, you know, primarily I hope that these things are for me and you, right? Is that, you know, because of our relationship, we're pretty transparent and we'll tell each other what we think, and it allows us to have some, you know, pretty good dialogues and challenge each other on some questions. And, you know, I'm gonna gain from this. You know, we're gonna gain from this interaction, and because we're in a difficult time where people are trying to find different avenues to supplement their Bible study. If this is of some value, then praise the Lord. You know, it's really not more than we're bantering about anyway, right? So this is just gravy for us. But you know, if it helps somebody else, that's great.
Right. I mean, I don't want to go all children of Israel getting ready to be thrown in the fiery furnace that, you know, even if it's terrible, we're still going to be good here. You know, I think there's probably some value for people watching, and I hope so. Like I said, our main goal here is to try to provide some content. We know that many of you long for those adult Bible classes that we get to sit in, right? That you long for this back and forth and sharing of ideas and trying to parse through something together. And really that's what we're trying to provide in our limited scope, right? You know, we're by no means, you know, the perfect example of any of these things. And we're going to be transparent. We're going to mess some stuff up and be goofy through it because that's just our personality.
Yes.
But we hope that as you, you know, as you tune in with us, that you can find some value out of it. And if along the way there's some specific things that you want us to address, to cover, some questions or something, please post in the comments. Last thing before we wrap, Michael does have some fresh breaking news to also announce. To post this.
Yeah, so apparently I'm going to be hip with the rest of you kids, and I have yet to join this Facebook thing that I hear all the people talking about, and so that's happening tonight allegedly. Is I'm going to get a Facebook page. This will be my first post if you share it with me, and so hello world. It's like MySpace, right?
It's that similar. The best thing about this is to all Michael's acumen and background, and he's got 2 or 3 pages of credentials that we could list off. One that I'm sure we'll have time to mention as being a Hall of Famer, which is outstanding, on the long resume and letters after his name. But the best thing is that his wife controls the technology in the house. So there's the one who's setting up the Facebook page. I think she's going to give him a username and password later. Tara also, give her a shout out as we're closing this thing too. All of the graphics that you ever see on any of my sermons come from Tara. So she does those for me every week and just really does a phenomenal job as a labor of love. I think as she said in a text to me, her payment from me is in sarcastic comments. So that's the type of friendship that we've had for a long time. So I appreciate her a lot. And I'm really thankful that she's added Michael to the digital era and allows us the format to do some stuff like this.
It is by her blessing that I have the Wi-Fi password. And so as long as that continues, we'll do this again.
All right. That sounds good. Thank you all for listening in with us. We'll tune out for tonight, but we'll try to do, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 of these a week, depending on what time gives us. But we'll post out as much.
What else you got to do?
You'll keep clicking on. It's true. I mean, we're here in the basement and in the office, and we'll, like I said, we'll try to throw some stuff out. Comment, like, view, let us know if this is valuable to you. As Michael said, that may or may not impact whether we keep doing this. We'll probably keep doing it as long as we enjoy it. But if you all throw some stuff at us, that kind of helps maybe in the direction that we want to go moving forward. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll sign up for tonight.
Love you, brother.